I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, in a narrow brick townhouse that looked elegant from the outside but always felt tight inside. The place had 3 floors, long hallways, and windows that let in light only when the sun was polite enough to angle right. My father, Daniel Harper, was a history teacher who loved quiet museums, maps, and small discoveries. He was the one who used to bring me to local galleries on Saturdays, letting me hold sketch pads while he spoke softly about light and form. When he died of a heart attack when I was 16, the house grew louder in its silence. After his death, my mother, Vivian, changed. She was elegant but controlling, a woman who believed order was love and rules were comfort. Within a year, she remarried. Her new husband, Charles Whitmore, was a polished real estate broker who carried the smell of cologne and money. He was kind at first, then careful, and soon critical. He liked perfect schedules, neat attire, and people who shared his views. Charles had a son and a daughter from a previous marriage, and within a few years, they became the golden pair of our new family. Oliver, the half-brother who always smiled for cameras, was praised for every small thing he did. Claire, the younger half-sister, danced, painted, and received applause for breathing. I learned early that my name did not come up in their conversations unless I was being compared. When Charles bought Oliver a silver Audi for his 18th birthday, my mother clapped proudly and said, "He deserves it. He's worked so hard." I had graduated from high school that same week with honors, but no one mentioned it at dinner. I stayed quiet and learned how to disappear while still being in the room. The trick was to be useful, but unnoticeable. I ran errands, fetched tea, and nodded during conversations that never included me. Inside, I promised myself that one day I would never need anyone's approval again. I kept my father close by, keeping his world alive. On Saturdays, I took the Red Line to the South End and worked at a small art gallery owned by an older woman named Ruth. She paid me $10 an hour, let me file exhibition reports, and trusted me with the simplest but most sacred task: unwrapping paintings. The smell of varnish and linen became my comfort. Art did not judge or correct. It only asked you to look closely and tell the truth. With scholarships and savings, I enrolled at Boston University to study art history. My studio apartment in Jamaica Plain had a mattress, 2 shelves, and 1 chair that doubled as my desk. I worked part-time at a cafe, pulling espresso shots and memorizing regulars' orders while rewriting essays in my head. Life was lean, but it was mine. I measured my progress not by comfort, but by independence. After graduation, I landed my first real job as an assistant curator at a small museum in Providence, Rhode Island. My salary was $44,000 a year, more than I had ever made. The attic I rented for $850 a month had slanted ceilings and no air conditioning, but it was a beginning. I learned everything I could: how to handle insurance forms, negotiate shipping contracts, and manage donors without losing my integrity. My boss often said I was too serious, but seriousness had kept me alive. By 26, I was restless. I applied for a position in New York and, to my surprise, got it. A junior curator role at a mid-sized museum near Central Park. The pay rose to $62,000, though rent quickly swallowed the difference. I shared a Washington Heights apartment with a teacher named Paige. We lived off coffee and hope, both of us chasing meaning in cities that rewarded performance more than honesty. Back in Boston, my mother and Charles expanded the townhouse, turning my old room into his office. The walls that once held my father's sketches now displayed real estate awards. Family dinners felt like interviews. When I mentioned a show I was helping organize, Charles smiled with that professional charm that always cut deep. "That's nice," he said. "But have you thought about a real career path?" My mother nodded in agreement. I kept eating, pretending the food didn't taste like ashes. My solace came from art hunting. On weekends, I wandered flea markets, church sales, and estate auctions across New England. My eyes sharpened with every find. Once, I bought a faded oil painting for $200 that later turned out to be an unsigned early work by a regional master. A dealer offered me $2,500, but I refused. It wasn't just about money, it was about proof. Proof that I could see value where others saw dust. At 28, I moved to a rent-stabilized one-bedroom apartment in Astoria for $1,720 a month. The kitchen was the size of a closet, but it had morning light and a small balcony where I kept two plants alive by accident. My salary had climbed to $78,000, and for the first time, I could breathe without counting every dollar. I framed my favorite finds and hung them on the walls like quiet victories. Even then, I kept reaching out to my half-siblings, sending Claire art books and Oliver concert tickets. I thought goodwill could build bridges, but it only widened the silence. My mother called once to tell me I was being distant. I almost laughed. Distant was the only way I had survived. Then came the call that shifted everything. It was a Sunday afternoon in May. My phone buzzed while I was cataloging a small exhibit on American Impressionists. My grandfather, Edward Harper, had passed away in Portland, Maine. He had been my father's father, a quiet man with large hands and a calm voice. He was the one who had taught me how to use a level, how to frame a painting properly, and how to spot a lie in a label. At the funeral, a lawyer approached me after the service and handed me a sealed envelope. My grandfather's handwriting was firm and steady. Inside was a letter and a small brass key taped to the paper. The letter said three things: that he was proud of me, that I would find a metal trunk stored under a false name in South Portland, and that the trunk belonged to his grandchildren, not his children. I rented a small car and drove north the next morning. The air was clear, the roads empty. The storage facilities smelled like cold metal and old dust. The manager looked surprised when the key fit perfectly. Inside, under dim lights, sat a long steel trunk, a banker's box, and a rolled canvas wrapped in waxed paper. I sat on the concrete floor for a while, trying to breathe. Then I cried quietly, the way my father used to clear his throat before saying something important. When the tears dried, I stood up, brushed the dust off my jeans, and lifted the lid. Inside was the beginning of everything my mother could never control, and everything my grandfather had protected. It was the proof that someone in my bloodline had believed in me all along. And though I didn't yet know what was inside, I could feel it. My life was about to change forever. I carried the metal trunk into my friend's small storage unit in Long Island City on a gray afternoon. The air smelled of dust and rain, the kind that clings to steel doors. We set it on a table, and for a long moment, I just stared at it. The brass key in my hand felt heavier than it should have. When I finally turned in the lock, the lid lifted with a dry sigh, as if the trunk had been holding its breath for years. Inside were neatly packed folders, artist letters, and small works wrapped in aged tissue. I found oil sketches of Maine harbors, studies of city streets, and portraits with soft, unfinished edges. Each piece carried a story, and each receipt tucked beside it bore my grandfather's tidy handwriting. His eye had always been sharp. Even in his simplicity, he had collected with care, decade after decade, choosing authenticity over fashion. At the bottom sat a banker's box. Inside were legal papers, trust instruments, insurance valuations, and formal letters from a law office in Portland. My name appeared alongside two others, Hannah Harper and Marcus Harper, my cousins. I hadn't seen either in years. We'd grown up together for a time, but life scattered us after our fathers died. I spent that evening cross-legged on the floor, reading through the documents. The language was dense, but clear enough. Years ago, my grandfather had placed his collection, paintings, sketches, studies, and photographs, into a trust held for his grandchildren. It was protected from his children and stepchildren, and the trustees were a Boston bank and a fiduciary named Ruth Collins, a former museum registrar. He had even written his own rule on the front page: no distributions to parents. No distributions to step-parents. Education, conservation, and public access before profit. When I saw that line, I felt tears sting my eyes. He had known. He had seen how my mother's control and Charles's polish left no air for anyone who didn't serve their narrative. This was his way of carving out freedom for us, a silent act of rebellion wrapped in law and ink. The next morning, I called Ruth Collins. Her voice was low and measured. She suggested we meet 2 days later at a cafe near Bryant Park. When she arrived, She carried a canvas tote and had the kind of steady eyes that didn't waver. I handed her my grandfather's letter and the brass key. She smiled slightly and nodded.
He was steady, she said.
He bought what he understood and trusted time more than taste. He told me once he didn't believe in people who loved their mirrors too much. We went over everything. She confirmed the trust was active and legally sealed until my 32nd birthday, 3 months away. At that time, the trustees would release the full inventory, appraisals, and storage records. The trust held not just the pieces in the trunk but also a second vault in Boston, where more substantial works were kept under climate control. She flipped through her notes and said, "The last verified valuation was $70 million, but that was conservative." The words hit me harder than I expected. 70 million. I thought of my modest museum paycheck, my rent, my student loans, and the price of groceries I still compared across stores. That number wasn't money. It was history, security, and legacy all wrapped together. It was proof that something of my family's story couldn't be rewritten by my mother or her husband. I spent the next few days barely sleeping. I reread every file, every insurance note, every appraisal sheet. I researched the artists online and traced sales histories. My grandfather hadn't just collected, he had preserved forgotten voices. Regional painters, women who never found big galleries, craftsmen whose works told quiet stories about working towns and fading coastlines. His collection wasn't just valuable, it was human. That weekend, I called my cousins. Hannah, now a nurse in Chicago, answered first. Her voice cracked with surprise when I told her what our grandfather had done. Marcus, an industrial designer in Portland, Oregon, was silent for a long time before saying, "He always said fairness isn't about inheritance. It's about repair." We agreed to meet in New York later that summer for our mother's 65th birthday dinner, a dinner I already dreaded. It would be the perfect stage for what my mother loved most, control. I didn't tell her about the trust. Not yet. I wanted to understand everything before I faced her. At work, I buried myself in tasks. I closed one exhibit and opened another, balancing budgets and guiding donors through rehearsed enthusiasm. But something had shifted inside me. For the first time, I didn't feel small. I wasn't hustling for crumbs of approval anymore. I also hired a lawyer. Her name was Gabrielle Price, a sharp, calm woman recommended by a donor friend. She charged $450 an hour and didn't waste a second of it. Sitting in her Manhattan office surrounded by framed degrees, I told her the entire story. She listened without interrupting, then said, "You did the right thing calling me. The value is significant, and if there's family tension, we'll need a wall of documentation." We reviewed the trust, the letters, and the legal restrictions. She explained that the structure was airtight and would withstand any challenge. Still, she told me to document every family contact from that moment on: texts, calls, letters. My mother and Charles were known for manipulation dressed as civility. "You'll want to stay polite," Gabrielle advised, "but keep the facts clean and the paper trail cleaner." I left her office feeling protected for the first time in years. That night, I walked through Central Park under the streetlights, thinking about how different my life had become in a matter of weeks. I wasn't rich. Not yet. But I had leverage, something no one in my family could buy or take away. In July, my half-sister Claire posted photos from a yacht party in Newport, smiling beside her boyfriend. The caption read "Family First." I double-tapped it, not out of affection, but because irony deserved acknowledgement. My half-brother Oliver texted me a link to an upscale restaurant on Park Avenue, where the birthday dinner would be held. He wrote, "Black tie optional, speeches expected." I could already picture it. The long table, the smug toasts, the subtle reminders of my absence from their definition of success. But this time, I would not shrink. The week before the dinner, Charles called me. His voice was smooth as always, but the message was sharp. "We think it's time for clarity," he said. "Your mother wants to set expectations. The family assets are arranged, and you're not included in the same way. We don't want confusion later." I held my phone tight. "If there's any statement about inheritance, I'd prefer it in writing," I said. He paused. "Let's not make this hostile." Just come to dinner with a positive attitude. Bring a small gift, something thoughtful. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. Then I bought a hardcover book for $48 titled American Women Artists, 1900 to 1950. I wrapped it in brown paper and tied it with twine. The next morning, I met with Gabrielle again. We outlined what I might face and what I could reveal. She said, "Stay calm. Power sits quietly. Let them talk first." That night, I placed the trunk's key back into my jewelry box and closed the lid. The next chapter of my life was waiting at a Park Avenue dinner table, and this time, I wasn't coming as the forgotten daughter. I was coming as the heir my grandfather had chosen. The night of my mother's 65th birthday arrived warm and flawless, the kind of August evening New York wears like silk. I remember standing outside the Park Avenue restaurant, its marble facade glowing under soft lights, and feeling a strange calm settle in my chest. The black dress I wore wasn't new, but it fit perfectly. My hands didn't shake as I pushed open the glass door and stepped inside. The dining room looked like a magazine spread, crystal chandeliers, polished cutlery, and floral arrangements that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Charles stood near the entrance, greeting guests with his signature salesman smile, the kind that stretched too far. When he saw me, his expression flickered. "You made it," he said smoothly, though his tone carried surprise. My mother sat at the head of a long table surrounded by family and a few of Charles's business friends. She wore a silver dress, hair pinned in its usual immaculate style, pearls glinting under the lights. Oliver and Claire flanked her like royalty in training, laughing too loudly at something one of Charles's associates said. I found my seat near the end of the table. No one made space for me. That was fine. I wasn't here for their warmth. Dinner passed in waves of polite conversation and forced laughter. The servers floated through the room like trained dancers, refilling glasses, clearing plates, and announcing courses with gentle precision. I watched everyone, noting how easily they performed the role of a perfect family. My mother caught my eye once and offered a cool smile that didn't reach her eyes. I returned it with one that did. When dessert was finished, Charles rose, tapping his glass with a spoon. The sound cut through the chatter like a bell. "Before we close the evening," he began, "I'd like to make a toast." He praised my mother for her grace, her resilience, her vision. He mentioned their properties, the Boston townhouse, the New Hampshire lake cottage, and a new investment condo in Miami they planned to purchase. "Our family legacy continues," he said proudly. I counted silently. He said the phrase family legacy 3 times in less than a minute. Then my mother stood, lifting her glass. Her voice carried the steady rhythm of someone who has rehearsed every word. "Thank you, Charles," she said. "And thank you all for being here. At 65, I've learned that family is built on decisions, clear ones." Her gaze landed on me. Which brings me to an announcement. After careful thought, I've finalized my estate plans. The townhouse and the lake cottage will go to Oliver and Claire. Other assets are assigned to the Whitmore Family Foundation, which Charles and I will manage together. I've decided not to include my eldest in these distributions. It's time she stands entirely on her own. A hush swept across the table. Someone dropped a fork. Oliver's smile froze mid-laugh. Claire glanced at me, then at her mother, unsure if she should look sorry or proud. I took a slow sip of water and set my glass down carefully. "Thank you for the clarity," I said evenly. My voice didn't tremble. I reached for the small package beside my plate and slid it toward her. "I brought a gift too. A book, American Women Artists, 1900 to 1950. I think you'll appreciate it." She blinked, uncertain, as I stood. The room shifted slightly, like the air before a storm. "Since we're discussing legacy," I continued, "there's something I should share. Our grandfather, Edward Harper, created a trust decades ago. It's not subject to your will or Charles's. The trust holds an art collection, sealed, preserved, and valued conservatively at $70 million. Every conversation in the room stopped. My mother's face went pale. Charles's practiced smile faltered into confusion. Oliver stared at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. Claire whispered. 70 million? I nodded. The trust belongs to his grandchildren, me, Hannah, and Marcus. It's managed by a Boston bank and a fiduciary named Ruth Collins. The trust opens fully next month, on my 32nd birthday. I have the key, the inventory, and counsel overseeing the process. And before you ask, Grandfather wrote one rule at the top: education, conservation, and public access before profit. For a long moment, no one moved. My mother's lips parted slightly, as if searching for a response that wouldn't sound desperate. Charles finally spoke. There must be a misunderstanding. Any assets of that nature should pass through family channels. We can help manage them properly. I smiled gently. You can't. The trust was designed to prevent interference. I brought documentation. I reached into my bag and pulled out an envelope, sliding it across the table. Inside were copies of the trust summary, the trustee contacts, and a letter from my lawyer, Gabrielle. The letter stated plainly that any attempt to claim, move, or obstruct trust property would trigger immediate legal action, injunctive relief, sanctions, and public notice. Charles opened the envelope, scanned a few lines, then handed it to my mother with a tight jaw. "This is outrageous," he muttered.
Not really, I said.
"It's just binding." My mother's hands trembled slightly as she folded the letter. She tried to speak, but her voice came out uneven. "You've gone behind the family, Cassandra. You've chosen strangers over us." I met her eyes.
No.
I chose honesty over control. Grandfather made sure his work wouldn't be buried under your husband's balance sheets. Gasps rippled around the table. Oliver muttered something about lawyers. Claire just stared, cheeks flushed, like she couldn't decide which side to be on. I softened my tone. "I don't want to fight. I'm not here to embarrass you. I only wanted the truth said aloud. In October, the trust will open fully. My cousins and I are forming a nonprofit arts foundation to preserve the collection and make it public. Our first exhibit will be in New York and Boston. Scholarships and educational programs will follow." Charles's jaw tightened. "You're overstepping, Cassandra. This isn't a decision for you alone." I looked him squarely in the eye. "You're right, it isn't. It's a decision my grandfather made long before you arrived. I'm simply following through." For a moment, I thought he might raise his voice, but then he caught himself. Charles was a man who lived on appearances. Public composure was his armor. He turned to the waiter and said curtly, "We're done here. Bring the check." My mother remained seated, staring down at her untouched dessert. "You don't understand what you've done," she whispered. "I understand exactly," I replied softly. "You built a world where approval was currency. I built one where truth is."
The room was silent.
Even the servers hesitated to move. Finally, I reached for my coat. "I'll leave you to celebrate. After all, it's your night." I walked out without looking back. The night air felt clean against my skin, cool and sharp, like a first breath after surfacing from deep water. I hailed a cab and watched the lights blur across the windows as the city passed by. When I reached my apartment, Paige was waiting up for me, tea steaming on the table. "How bad was it?" she asked. I smiled tiredly and sank into the couch. "About as bad as it needed to be." She handed me the cup and said quietly, "Then it was perfect." I stared out the window at the skyline. Somewhere beyond those towers, the collection slept in its sealed vault, waiting for me to open it. For once, the future didn't feel like something I had to beg for. It felt like something I already owned. "Keep your tools together," Paige said, echoing my grandfather's favorite line. I nodded. "I will," I whispered, and for the first time in my life, I believed it. The morning of my 32nd birthday broke soft and gray over Boston. I sat in the conference room of the law firm with Ruth Collins and the bank trustee, the blinds half open to the quiet sweep of the Charles River. The table was lined with folders, stamped envelopes, and a single sealed file that had been waiting 16 years for this day. My hands rested on the table as Ruth broke the seal with the same care she might use on a rare painting. Inside was the complete inventory of my grandfather's collection, more than 100 works, cataloged, appraised, and insured. Regional masters, early sketches from artists who later became household names, and several photographs of American city life from the 1930s that had been unseen for decades. Each page shimmered with the quiet brilliance of a life spent seeing beauty where others saw nothing. The total valuation, even at its most conservative estimate, stood at $70 million. I felt the number echo inside me, not as greed, but as weight, a responsibility I had been chosen to carry. We called my cousins Hannah and Marcus on speakerphone. Their voices filled the room with laughter, awe, and the kind of disbelief that turns quickly into resolve. Together, we agreed on what came next: the formation of the Harper Arts Trust, a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving and sharing our grandfather's collection. The mission was simple and clear: to bring original American art to schools and small towns that rarely saw it in person. We set a modest but meaningful budget: $1.2 million a year for conservation, transportation, and educational programs. Every piece of paperwork, every clause felt like a promise. I watched the trustees sign the final document, and in that moment, I realized something I hadn't before. This wasn't an inheritance. It was a second chance. One not just for me, but for every kid who would one day stand in front of a painting and realize they belonged to the same story. The weeks that followed were a blur of meetings, calls, and plans. Ruth handled the legal filings. Hannah began outlining the structure of our school outreach program. Marcus started sketching ideas for portable exhibition stands that could travel to smaller towns. We chose a name for the first major exhibition: A Plain Light, American Work and Quiet Rooms. I wanted the title to echo what my grandfather had taught me, that art didn't need to shout to matter. I coordinated with a respected museum in New York for a 6-month public display. The loan agreement was fair, the security details airtight, and the curatorial support generous. We kept the tone humble: no marble halls, no velvet ropes, no elite circles. This exhibit was meant for everyone. I wrote the curatorial statement myself, beginning with one simple line: "Beauty belongs to those who look." By November, something else shifted in me. I wanted a place that reflected who I was becoming, not who I'd been. After years of renting small apartments and sharing walls with strangers, I found a house in Beacon, New York, about 90 minutes north of the city. It was a modest 2-bedroom with a deep front porch and a north-facing window perfect for morning light. The price was $415,000. I put down $83,000 from my savings and a small advance from a book deal I'd recently signed about regional women artists of the 20th century. When the papers were signed, I stood in the empty living room and let the silence settle. The floors creaked faintly under my shoes, and for once, that sound didn't mean fragility. It meant foundation. I hung one painting above the mantel, not from the trust, but from my personal collection, a small watercolor of a harbor my grandfather once admired. In December, a letter arrived from my mother. The envelope was heavy, the handwriting familiar but strained. It began sharp, accusing and defensive, and ended soft, almost pleading. She wrote that she felt blindsided by my decisions and cut out of the family narrative. She proposed merging the Harper Arts Trust with a new foundation she and Charles had drafted. I could almost hear his voice behind the words. I took 2 days to respond. My letter was brief, but kind. I included a copy of the Trust's public mission statement, 2 complimentary tickets to the exhibit opening, and a note that read, "I love you, but I will not move this line." Charles called a week later, his voice still smooth but colder now. He hinted at legal reconsiderations, suggesting they might challenge the trust structure. I told him politely that my lawyer, Gabrielle, would be in touch. She sent him a response the next morning: 3 paragraphs, 3 citations, and not a single adjective. The call stopped. By January, the press release for A Plain Light went out. Major newspapers picked it up, and the tone was exactly what I hoped: respectful, curious, and admiring. A forgotten American collection reemerges through the hands of the next generation, one article read. For the first time, my name appeared not as a footnote in someone else's legacy, but as part of the headline. Spring came fast, and with it, the opening of the exhibit. The morning of the first free admission day, I stood outside the museum as a line stretched around the block. Families, students, and tourists waited patiently, some holding cameras, others holding coffee. When the doors opened, the crowd flowed in like a tide. Inside, I watched a group of ninth graders stand before a 1934 cityscape and argue playfully about whether the light hitting a tenement window was sunrise or sunset. Nearby, a teacher wiped her eyes and laughed at herself. Hannah manned the education desk, smiling as she explained our outreach plans to parents. Marcus, ever the designer, had set up a feedback wall where visitors could write what the art made them feel. By noon, it was covered in bright paper squares. Hope, peace, memory, love. Then I saw her. My mother stood near the center of the gallery, wearing a navy dress and low heels. For the first time in years, her posture was not one of command, but of quiet observation. She paused before a small portrait of a young woman sitting at a table, sunlight touching her hands. She turned to me and said softly, "Your grandfather made a good plan." "Yes," I said. "He did." We didn't hug. We didn't need to. Sometimes peace isn't loud. It's a single breath shared between people who've fought long enough to understand the cost of silence. Over the next months, the exhibit drew record attendance. Oliver came twice, asking intelligent questions about art loans and storage insurance. Claire brought her roommate, posted photos, and tagged me in her story with a simple caption, "Proud sister." My mother sent a $25,000 check to the trust with a handwritten note for the schools.
He'd have liked that.
I didn't frame it. I just smiled and moved forward. Now I live quietly in my beacon house. My days start early, with coffee, emails, and soft light through the north window. Some days, I spend hours reviewing condition reports or walking through galleries to approve new installations. Other days, I sit on my porch with a notebook, sketching ideas for future exhibits. I am not waiting to be chosen anymore. I am not decorating someone else's story. I am building spaces where others can see themselves. When a plane light traveled to Boston later that year, I added one small photograph near the exit. It showed an old wooden level resting on a workbench with a note beneath it that read, "Keep your tools together." Visitors paused to read it, often smiling as they walked away. Every time I passed that photo, I thought of my grandfather's steady voice, my father's quiet faith, and the long road from the girl who was told she'd never belong to the woman who now held her own keys. A steady life, I've learned, is not built on noise or applause. It's built on small, true steps, each one a doorway you open for others. And as I lock up the gallery each night or sit on my porch watching the light fade into clean lines, I remind myself, this is my legacy. This is enough.